December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest in Belgium. Sergeant Thomas McKenna crouched in a frozen foxhole, his breath creating small clouds in the bitter morning air as the temperature hovered around 15 degrees below zero. Through the dense fog that blanketed the forest, he could hear the distinctive rumble of engines, not American engines, but something heavier, more mechanical, something that made the ground itself seem to vibrate with an unfamiliar rhythm. The men of Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, believed they were holding a quiet sector, a place where they could rest after months of advancing through France. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove to be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these American soldiers were about to experience would become one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. A moment when a single radio transmission would transform absolute encirclement into overwhelming victory, revealing the true power of American industrial might and coordination in a way that would shatter every assumption the German forces had made about this sector of the front. The fog was so thick that morning that McKenna could barely see 10 feet in front of his position. He had been in combat since Normandy, survived the Bocage country, pushed through countless French villages, and thought he had seen everything the war could throw at him. The 28-year-old from Pittsburgh had even earned a Bronze Star for his actions near St. Lo, but nothing in his 6 months of combat had prepared him for what was about to unfold. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, the company's radio operator, sat next to McKenna in the foxhole, his SCR 300 radio wrapped in canvas to protect it from the moisture. The 22-year-old from Chicago had joined the unit as a replacement just 3 weeks earlier, fresh from radio school at Fort Benning. He kept checking the radio's batteries obsessively, a nervous habit that McKenna had noticed but never mentioned. The kid was good at his job, meticulous, and McKenna appreciated that kind of attention to detail. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came not from sight, but from sound. Lieutenant Robert Chen, a 25-year-old platoon leader from San Francisco who had graduated from West Point just 2 years before, heard it first. The distinctive clank and squeal of tracked vehicles moving through the forest, but not just one or two, dozens of them, maybe more. He grabbed his field glasses and tried to peer through the fog, but visibility remained almost zero. Then came the voices, German voices, lots of them. Within minutes, the situation became crystal clear, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Baker Company, consisting of 143 men, found themselves completely surrounded. German infantry had infiltrated through the fog, moving with practiced silence, and had established positions all around the American perimeter. The tracked vehicles they heard were not just a few reconnaissance units. Intelligence would later confirm there were at least 22 medium vehicles and countless infantry in the immediate area, part of a much larger offensive operation. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a 32-year-old officer who had survived the Eastern campaigns and been transferred west just 2 months earlier, stood at the edge of the American position. He had studied at Heidelberg before the war, spoke fluent English, and had earned his reputation as a meticulous by-the-book officer. He carried with him a megaphone, recently acquired from a supply depot, and he intended to use it to avoid unnecessary casualties on both sides. Weber surveyed the situation with professional satisfaction. His force had executed the maneuver perfectly. The fog had provided ideal cover, and his men had positioned themselves in a textbook encirclement. Through his field glasses, he could make out the American positions, well dug but clearly surprised, with no prepared fallback positions or reinforcement routes. By his calculation, based on standard American company organization, he had approximately 150 enemy soldiers trapped with nowhere to go. He raised the megaphone to his lips and spoke in clear, almost unaccented English, his voice carrying across the frozen landscape with an eerie authority that made every American in earshot go still. "We have you surrounded. You are cut off from your lines. You have no reinforcements coming. Your situation is hopeless. I am offering you the chance to surrender with honor. You have fought well, but this battle is over. Throw down your weapons and show white flags, and I give you my word as an officer that you will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. You have 5 minutes to decide." In the foxhole, McKenna exchanged a glance with Kowalski. The young radioman's hands were shaking, but not from the cold. McKenna could see other soldiers looking toward Lieutenant Chen's position, waiting for orders, their faces showing the kind of fear that comes from knowing you might be about to become a prisoner of war, or worse. Lieutenant Chen, however, was already moving. He crawled through the snow to McKenna's position, keeping low to avoid drawing fire. His face was set with determination, not panic. He had been trained at West Point to think strategically, to never accept the enemy's assessment of the situation, and something about Weber's confident speech bothered him. If they were truly as helpless as the German officer claimed, why bother offering surrender terms? Why not just wait them out? "McKenna," he said quietly, his breath frosting in the air, "get me battalion headquarters on that radio, right now." The sergeant nodded to Kowalski, who immediately began adjusting the frequency on the SCR 300, his nervous energy now channeled into purposeful action. The radio crackled with static, then cleared. Kowalski handed the handset to Chen, who spoke in the calm, measured tones they had drilled into him at the academy. "Raindrop 6, this is Baker 2. Urgent traffic. We are completely surrounded by enemy forces in grid coordinates 583-417. Estimate 2 to 3 companies of infantry with armor support. Enemy commander is offering surrender terms. Request immediate fire mission, all available assets. I say again, all available assets. We will mark our position with colored smoke. How copy?" There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Static hissed across the frozen forest. Kowalski checked the connections compulsively, making sure nothing had come loose. Then the radio spoke back, and the voice that came through was calm, almost routine, as if this kind of request came through every day. "Baker 2, Raindrop 6. Good copy on all. Stand by for fire mission. Mark your position with yellow smoke on my command. Estimate time to first rounds 4 minutes. Keep your heads down. Out. 4 minutes." Chen looked at his watch, a Hamilton his father had given him when he graduated from West Point. The second hand seemed to move with agonizing slowness. Around him, the German voices continued calling out in English, urging surrender, counting down the time remaining. What Weber did not know, what he could not have known, was that the sector Baker Company occupied was not some isolated, forgotten corner of the front. It was, in fact, a carefully monitored position within range of 3 separate American artillery battalions, the 319th Field Artillery Battalion with 12 105mm howitzers, the 902nd Field Artillery Battalion with 12 155mm guns, and the 741st Tank Battalion, which had recently been equipped with the new M4A3E8 Sherman tanks, mounting 76mm high-velocity guns, positioned just 8 kilometers to the rear. Moreover, the weather that morning, the thick fog that Weber had considered such an advantage for his maneuver, was beginning to lift. The meteorological report that had reached Allied headquarters at 0600 hours predicted clearing skies by 0830, and when the skies cleared over the Ardennes that winter, it meant something very specific. It meant the aircraft could fly. Major Patricia Donnelly, a 31-year-old artillery liaison officer from Boston, who had been one of the first women to serve in a combat-adjacent role, sat in the Fire Direction Center 7 kilometers behind the front lines. She had graduated from Wellesley with a mathematics degree in 1935, and her ability to calculate firing solutions had earned her grudging respect from officers who initially doubted whether a woman belonged anywhere near a combat zone. When Chen's radio call came through, she was already studying the map, her mind calculating trajectories and blast radii with practiced precision. She turned to Captain James Sullivan, the fire direction officer, a 35-year-old former insurance adjuster from Newark, who had discovered an unexpected talent for coordinating artillery fires. "Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that Chen had used on the radio. "We have a surrounded unit requesting all available assets. Grid 583-417. Enemy strength estimated at 2 to 3 companies with armor. This is priority immediate." Sullivan looked at the map, then at the disposition of units under his command. His mind, trained by years of calculating actuarial tables, rapidly processed the information. He picked up the field telephone connecting him to the artillery battalions. All batteries, priority fire mission, requesting full battery salvos, continuous fire until further notice. Prepare for adjustment on target. First rounds in 3 minutes. Back in the forest, Weber's 5 minutes were almost up. He had expected to see white flags by now, or at least some indication of discussion among the Americans. Instead, there was only silence. It puzzled him. He had seen American units surrender before when faced with hopeless situations. These soldiers had to know they had no chance of relief. The German offensive had punched through the American lines in multiple places. Reinforcements would be hours away at minimum, if they came at all. He was about to give the order to commence firing when he saw something that made him pause. From the center of the American position, a yellow smoke grenade had been deployed. The colored smoke rose slowly through the thinning fog, creating a distinctive marker visible for kilometers around. It was not a surrender signal. Surrender signals were white. This was something else entirely. Weber felt the first stirring of unease. In his experience, colored smoke meant one thing: artillery spotting. But surely these surrounded Americans did not have the capability to call in artillery fire. They were cut off, isolated, with no radio communication to their higher headquarters. That was what his intelligence officers had assured him. The communication lines in this sector had been severed by the advance elements of the offensive. Except they had not been. Kowalski's radio was working perfectly. The first sound was a whistle, high-pitched and growing rapidly louder. Weber's experienced ears recognized it instantly, and his stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the shells were already arriving. The initial salvo from the 319th Field Artillery Battalion consisted of 12 105mm high-explosive rounds, each weighing 33 pounds and capable of creating a burst radius of 50 meters. They had been fired from a distance of 8 kilometers, reaching an apex of 2 kilometers altitude before descending at a near vertical angle. The time of flight from firing to impact was 38 seconds. The shells did not land on the American position. Major Donnelly's calculations had been precise, factoring in wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, and the curvature of the Earth itself. The rounds landed in a perfect pattern around the American perimeter, right on top of the German positions. The sound was unlike anything the younger American soldiers had ever experienced. Even veterans like McKenna, who had been through artillery barrages before, had never heard anything quite like this. The shells did not arrive one at a time, but in grouped salvos, creating a continuous rolling thunder that made the frozen ground shake and the air itself seem to vibrate. But that was just the beginning. The initial ranging salvo was followed immediately by a full battery fire for effect, 36 rounds in the first minute. Then the 155mm guns of the 902nd Battalion joined in, their heavier rounds creating even larger explosions, each shell weighing 95 pounds and producing a burst radius of 80 meters. The German forces, which moments before had been confidently surrounding what they believed to be a helpless American unit, found themselves on the receiving end of one of the most intense artillery bombardments of the entire Ardennes campaign. The carefully positioned infantry squads, the command posts, the vehicle positions, all of them came under simultaneous, overwhelming fire. Weber dove for cover in a shallow depression, his megaphone forgotten in the snow. Around him, his carefully organized units were being systematically dismantled by American firepower. The communications lines he had established were severed. The vehicle positions were taking direct hits. The fog that had provided such excellent cover for the approach now trapped his forces in a killing zone with limited visibility for retreat. In the American positions, Lieutenant Chen kept his men low in their foxholes, knowing that the artillery was landing precisely where Major Donnelly had calculated, around their perimeter, not on their position. The yellow smoke had done its job, marking them for friendly fire avoidance. Now it was simply a matter of keeping heads down and letting the artillery do its work. But the artillery was only the first wave. As Chen had been trained at West Point, combined arms meant exactly that, combining all available assets for maximum effect. The 741st Tank Battalion, which had been in reserve positions 8 kilometers to the rear, received the alert and immediately began moving forward. 12 M4A3 E8 Sherman tanks, each weighing 33 tons and carrying a crew of 5, rumbled toward the engagement at their maximum road speed of 40 kilometers per hour. And then the skies began to clear, just as the meteorological forecast had predicted. By 08:45, patches of blue sky were visible through the dissipating fog, and with clear skies came the aircraft. Captain Robert Mitchell, a 29-year-old P-47 Thunderbolt pilot from Texas who had flown 63 combat missions, received the call at 08:50. His squadron of 8 aircraft had been grounded for 3 days due to weather, and the pilots were eager to get back into action. The mission briefing was simple: ground support for a surrounded infantry unit, enemy forces in the open, perfect conditions for strafing runs. Mitchell's P-47, carrying 850 caliber machine guns and 6 high-velocity aircraft rockets, arrived over the target area at 09:05. From 2,000 feet altitude, he could see the entire situation laid out below. The American position marked with yellow smoke, the German forces scattered in a rough circle around them, vehicles abandoned or attempting to retreat through the forest roads. He keyed his radio to the squadron frequency. "This is Thunderbolt Lead. I have visual on target. Beginning attack run. Stay in formation and watch for friendly positions. They are marked with yellow smoke. Everything outside that perimeter is fair game." The P-47s came down in a steep dive, their engines screaming, each aircraft carrying enough firepower to engage an entire infantry company. The 50 caliber machine guns fired at a combined rate of over 3,000 rounds per minute per aircraft. The rockets, when launched, left trails of white smoke as they streaked toward their targets. For the German forces on the ground, already reeling from the artillery barrage, the arrival of the fighter aircraft was the final breaking point. The carefully organized encirclement dissolved into chaos. Units that had been trying to maintain positions under artillery fire now abandoned them entirely, seeking any cover available, any route of escape from the overwhelming American response. Weber, still crouched in his depression, watched his entire operation collapse in less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken from the moment the American lieutenant made his radio call to the complete disintegration of a textbook encirclement involving several hundred soldiers and multiple vehicles. The scale of the response was beyond anything he had prepared for, beyond anything his training had led him to expect. He had surrounded one isolated American company. The Americans had responded as if he had threatened an entire division headquarters. The disproportion was staggering, incomprehensible. What Weber was witnessing, what all the German forces in the Ardennes were discovering during those desperate winter weeks, was the fundamental reality of American military power in 1944. It was not about individual courage or tactical brilliance, though the Americans had both. It was about something far more overwhelming: industrial capacity translated into battlefield dominance. The United States was producing 17 aircraft carriers per year when Germany had none. American factories were manufacturing 50,000 aircraft annually when German production had fallen to 25,000, despite operating under constant threat. American steel production exceeded 100 million tons per year when Germany struggled to produce 30 million. American automotive plants had converted to produce vehicles at a rate of 1 truck every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This industrial supremacy meant that an isolated company of American soldiers, surrounded and cut off, could make a single radio call and bring down enough firepower to destroy a force 3 times their size. It meant that artillery battalions had enough ammunition to fire continuously without concern for rationing. It meant that fighter squadrons could afford to dedicate 8 aircraft to support one surrounded company because there were thousands more aircraft available. By 09:30, the engagement was effectively over. The German forces that had surrounded Baker Company were defeated, scattered, or in retreat. The Sherman tanks from the 741st Battalion arrived to find the immediate area secure, the enemy already withdrawn. The artillery continued firing along likely retreat routes, ensuring that the German forces could not regroup and attempt another encirclement. The cost to Baker Company was remarkably light. 3 men had been wounded by shell fragments from the initial German probing attacks before the artillery arrived. None were killed. The defensive position, well dug and reinforced over previous days, had protected them during the bombardment of the surrounding area. Kowalski's radio had functioned perfectly throughout, maintaining contact with headquarters and coordinating the fire missions. For the German forces, the casualties were severe. Later intelligence reports compiled from prisoner interrogations and captured documents indicated that the units involved in the encirclement suffered over 60% losses. Vehicles were abandoned, equipment was left scattered across the forest floor, and the carefully planned advance in that sector came to a complete halt. Lieutenant Chen, walking through the position after the all-clear was given, found Weber's megaphone half buried in the snow. He picked it up, examined it briefly, then set it aside. There was something almost sad about it. This instrument that had been used to demand surrender with such confidence just 30 minutes earlier. McKenna joined him, brushing snow off his uniform. The sergeant from Pittsburgh looked at the devastation around their position and shook his head slowly. "I have been in this war since Normandy," he said quietly, 6 months of fighting. "But I have never seen anything like this." That radio call, he gestured toward Kowalski, who was carefully repacking his SCR-300. That one radio call did what an entire battalion might not have been able to do 6 months ago. Chen nodded. He understood what McKenna meant. The American military machine had evolved throughout 1944, becoming more coordinated, more efficient, more overwhelmingly powerful. The systems that connected a lone infantry company to artillery battalions, tank units, and fighter squadrons had been refined through months of combat experience. The industrial base that supplied endless ammunition, fuel, and equipment had reached peak production. The training programs that produced officers like Major Donnelly, soldiers like Kowalski, and pilots like Mitchell were operating at full capacity. It was, in many ways, the perfect expression of American military philosophy: substitute firepower and material superiority for casualties whenever possible. Why risk men in a close-quarters battle when you could use artillery, tanks, and aircraft to achieve the same objective with minimal friendly losses? The broader implications of this engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The German offensive in the Ardennes, launched on December 16th with the hope of splitting the Allied armies and capturing critical supply ports, was predicated on certain assumptions. German planners believed that poor winter weather would ground Allied aircraft, that American units could be isolated and defeated in detail, and that the shock of a major offensive would create panic and disorganization in the American command structure. The engagement at Baker Company's position, repeated in dozens of similar incidents across the front during those winter weeks, proved every one of those assumptions catastrophically wrong. The weather did clear, allowing the aircraft to fly. American units could not be isolated because their radio networks remained functional. And far from creating panic, the American response was methodical, coordinated, and overwhelming. Private First Class Kowalski, sitting in his foxhole after the engagement, carefully documented the radio frequencies and procedures he had used in a small notebook he carried. The young man from Chicago who had been so nervous that morning had just participated in one of the most dramatic reversals of the campaign, and he wanted to make sure he remembered every detail for future reference. He had made that critical radio call, maintained contact throughout the engagement, and coordinated communications between the company and battalion headquarters. The meticulous attention to detail that McKenna had noticed earlier had quite possibly saved all their lives. For Major Donnelly, back at the Fire Direction Center, the engagement was entered into the logs as a successful fire mission with outstanding results. Her calculations had been precise, her coordination with multiple artillery units had been flawless, and not a single American soldier had been lost to friendly fire despite the intensity of the bombardment. She would later receive a Bronze Star for her work that day, though she would always insist that she had simply been doing her job, applying mathematics to military problems the way she had been trained to do. Captain Mitchell and his squadron returned to their airfield at 09:45, their aircraft empty of ammunition and rockets, but all pilots and planes intact. Mitchell filed his combat report, noting excellent visibility, effective coordination with ground forces, and significant damage inflicted on enemy positions. It was, by the standards of his 64 combat missions, a fairly routine operation. The fact that 8 aircraft could be dedicated to supporting one surrounded company struck him as neither unusual nor wasteful. It was simply how the American military operated in late 1944. The news of the engagement spread quickly through the American lines. Stories like this one, of surrounded units calling in devastating fire support, of seeming disasters transformed into victories through superior coordination and firepower, became part of the narrative that sustained morale during the difficult winter fighting. Soldiers knew that even if they found themselves in a desperate situation, they were never truly alone. The vast apparatus of American military power was always within radio range, ready to respond with overwhelming force. For the German forces, the engagement became yet another data point in a growing realization that the war was unwinnable. Officers like Weber, who survived the encounter and would eventually be captured 3 weeks later during the final collapse of the Ardennes offensive, came to understand that they were not fighting just against American soldiers, but against American factories, American logistics, American industrial capacity operating at a scale that Germany simply could not match. The war had become a contest not of tactics or courage, but of mathematics. And the mathematics were inexorable. Every Sherman tank knocked out could be replaced with 3 more within weeks. Every aircraft lost would be replaced by 5 more within days. Every artillery shell fired was backed by mountains of ammunition in supply depots that stretched back across France, across the English Channel, all the way to factories in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan that ran 24 hours a day, producing the material of war at a rate that defied comprehension. Weber, in his prisoner of war camp in France, would later write in a letter to his wife, a letter that would be discovered decades after the war in German archives, about that December morning in the Ardennes. He described the confidence he had felt standing before the American position with his megaphone, the certainty that he had executed a perfect tactical maneuver, and then he described the sound of the shells arriving, the sight of the aircraft diving from the clearing sky, and the realization that nothing he had learned at Heidelberg, nothing his training had prepared him for, had equipped him to fight against an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority. The war continued for 5 more months after the Ardennes offensive was finally halted. Baker Company fought through the remainder of the winter, crossed the Rhine in March, and was part of the forces that linked up with Soviet units on the Elbe River in April of 1945. Lieutenant Chen survived the war and returned to San Francisco, where he taught military history at a small college until his retirement in 1979. Sergeant McKenna went back to Pittsburgh and never spoke much about his combat service, though his family knew about his Bronze Star and the other decorations he kept in a box in his closet. Private First Class Kowalski became a radio engineer after the war, helping to develop early television broadcasting systems in Chicago. The megaphone that Chen had found in the snow was eventually turned in as a war souvenir and ended up in a small military museum in Belgium, where it sits today with a small placard describing the engagement at grid coordinates 583417 on December 16, 1944. The placard notes that a surrounded American company called in artillery and air support that defeated a larger German force, but the dry historical language cannot capture the human drama of that morning. The fear in the foxholes, the confidence of the German commander with his megaphone, the young radioman making the call that would change everything, and the overwhelming response that demonstrated the true nature of American military power in the final year of the Second World War. The story of Baker Company became one of thousands of similar stories from that war, each illustrating in its own way how industrial capacity, properly harnessed and efficiently deployed, could overcome numerical inferiority, tactical disadvantage, and even the fundamental military reality of encirclement. The Americans had learned to wage industrial warfare with a sophistication and scale that would define military thinking for generations to come. They had learned that firepower could substitute for manpower, that coordination could overcome chaos, and that a single radio call, properly made to the right people at the right time, could transform certain defeat into overwhelming victory. The lesson was not lost on military planners in the decades that followed. The emphasis on communications, coordination, and the rapid application of overwhelming firepower became core doctrines of American military thinking. The systems that allowed Lieutenant Chen to call in support from 3 artillery battalions, a tank battalion, and a fighter squadron with a single radio transmission became the foundation for even more sophisticated command and control systems in later conflicts. But on that December morning in 1944, none of those future implications mattered to the men of Baker Company. What mattered was that they had been surrounded, had faced surrender or worse, and had been saved by American industrial power, made manifest through artillery shells, tank rounds, and aircraft rockets. They had witnessed the transformation of their tactical situation from hopeless to victorious in less than 30 minutes, and they would never forget the sound of those first shells whistling overhead, the sight of the P-47s diving through the clearing sky, or the simple relief of knowing that they were part of a military machine that would never abandon them, never leave them unsupported, never accept their defeat as inevitable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.